Thank you very much, Mr. Grätz. A warm welcome to all of you here at the Kalkscheune also from my side. My name is Amira El Al, and I want to discuss in the next hour with our four panelists if we can imagine a world in which we have overcome us against them and in which we face global challenges together. In a world characterized by enormous inequalities and vast cultural differences, polarization is inevitable as the symptoms of inequality are manifested in migration, refugee flows, racism, xenophobia, and violent conflicts. Ours is a world of exclusive we and excluded they, yet the Universal Declaration for Human Rights states that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. Well, it feels like we need a different kind of dialogue, and tonight I want to discuss with our four panelists which steps we need to take in order to create a sustainable future for all of us, how to broaden a culture of we, and how to conceptualize a new humanity. Where are we heading? This we will hopefully find out tonight. And at the end of our discussion here on the panel, I would like to invite you in the audience to also ask questions, so get ready, and we will have somebody with a microphone going around. And now I would like to ask our panelists to come up on stage. A warm welcome. And for those of you in the audience, please just join me. For those in the audience who have not participated in the workshops during the day, let me introduce to you our speakers. I will start with the ladies. Farida Shahid, she is a sociologist and the executive director of Pakistan's leading women's rights organization, Shirkatgah, Women's Resource Center, that strives to empower women and further a gender equality social justice agenda. She is a recipient of numerous national and international human rights awards and has worked for more than 25 years promoting and protecting cultural rights. She was appointed the first UN independent experts in the field of cultural rights in 2009, and she continued as a special rapporteur for the United Nations on the same issue. A warm welcome to you. I would like to welcome Nina Obulyan. She is the Minister of Culture in Croatia since 2016. Before her appointment, she was working as a research associate at the Institute for Development and International Relations and as an Assistant Minister for International Relations and as the State Secretary for Culture and Media. She speaks at numerous scientific conferences and seminars, and she has published articles in national and international journals, books and anthologies on the topic of culture and media policies. A warm welcome to you. On the far left, there is Guinea Morozov. I hope I said it right. He is a contributing editor at the New Republic and author of The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, and To Save Everything, Click Here, The Folly of Technological Solutionism. He was a visiting scholar at Stanford University and a Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation, as well as a fellow at Georgetown University and at the Open Society Foundations. Between 2006 and 2008, he was director of new media at Transitions Online, and he's currently working as a free author for the New York Times, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, The Financial Times, and many, many other publications. Welcome to you. And last but definitely not least, Chandra Nayar. He's the founder and the CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT, an independent pan-Asian think tank based in Hong Kong, focused on advancing a deeper understanding of global issues, including the shift of economic and political influence from the West to Asia, the dynamic relationship between business and society, and the reshaping of the rules of global capitalism. He is a regular speaker at the World Economic Forum, APEC summits, OECD events, and various UN conferences, and he's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Governance for Sustainability. He's also the author of Consumptionomics, Asia's Role in Reshaping Capitalism and Saving the Planet. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us tonight. Well, there's quite a lot of questions I think we want to tackle tonight. Let's get on with it. Coming back to something that Mr. Gretz said in his introductory words, IFA is celebrating 100 years, and the principle of IFA is culture work is peace work. Farida Shahid, would you agree with that notion?
Thank you. You know, I think one of the key issues I would say is that when we talk about culture, we seem to talk of it devoid of power relations. And culture is not devoid of power relations. Cultures of belonging, so it can be for peace, it can be for war. I'm not saying IFA is for war. But the intentions behind what you want to do are always there. And I guess that's really important for me as a woman, to understand that no society, no community, it doesn't matter where you are, what kind of economic, social, political institution you're in, no society just has one culture. You have one dominant culture, and then you have multiple subaltern cultures. And culture is always, therefore, and women, of course, are part of the subalterns here. We don't determine how the overall community's culture is. And yet there's contestation. So when I think of culture, I think of nothing more than contestations and contested meanings, values, change. It's not static. It's a constantly evolving thing. And therefore, for all of us, if we are to move towards a culture of peace, we would have to consciously make that decision that this is something that we want to do and achieve. So I don't know, but at least to kick off the discussion.
Do you, from your point of view, do you think that we can achieve something sustainable with cultural exchange? Do you see culture as a dimension of sustainable development?
I think cultural exchanges are crucial. But I question, this statement. What if you and I became a we? I believe that, individuals are complex, multidimensional persons. But every time we use the pronoun we are making choices. We are using one or two or several markers of identity, never my whole person. I can say things like, if I say, we on this side of the room, it's a simple statement. What am I saying about everyone here? Everyone here is then not me, not us. They are the other. I've already said that just by using that transient. And it can be transient. It could be we at a bus stop. It can be we women. It can be we Pakistanis, we Muslims, we professionals, sociologists, etc. But it's always vis-a-vis another. The we is vis-a-vis other. When I'm sitting in my room by myself, I don't think of me as we. I think of me as me. But when I'm in social engagements, and I will try in that to use that marker of identity which is beneficial to me, which I think either will protect me in a particular or will give me an advantage in the interaction that I have with others. So I'm not sure if that's an exact answer to your question, but I do think we should not be reducing culture to manifestations of culture. Culture is not an object that I would hand over to you. Culture is constantly in a state of being reproduced by things that we do every single day. And there's no culture without human beings. Without our agency, there is none. So that's the kind of dynamics which I think we need to understand. We need to have exchanges that recognize the multiplicity of cultures within communities as well as across communities. So when we have exchanges, is everyone's voice being heard? And I think that's one of the things that we need to question is who is given the authority to speak for a community? From a women's perspective, very often older men, sorry, but that's the reality for most cultures. I don't get, why is it my experience is not as real, as valued, as somebody else who is speaking? So I think exchanges, absolutely. But it's not so much the having those as even the belongings of we and I. It's really the terms on which the exchanges take place, the terms on which I am accepted or not accepted or partially accepted as belonging to a group, if that makes sense. I'm not saying no exchanges. I'm saying what are the terms in which we engage those exchanges, and are everyone's voices represented in determining those exchanges?
But how can we make sure that all the voices are always included? I mean, that seems super
Should I give you my UN rapporteur version, which is, it is the duty of the states to ensure, because cultural rights are human rights, one of the duties of states is to ensure that all voices, both within communities as well as across communities, are heard on a basis of equality. Not that they determine, but that they are heard and included in the participatory decision-making of how to go forward. And although cultural rights is Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, Article 1 is about participation in decision-making, and I think we have to always see it as linked to the two.
You know, William, maybe coming to like culture and politics, you are an expert in the field of European cultural policy. From your experience, which role does culture play in international relations and in political cooperation? I mean, that's maybe something we were also...
We have 1 hour, right? And everybody has to speak.
Well, but okay. you're free to speak as much as you want.
No, I'm joking. You spoke this morning.
He's tired.
No, I wanted to start because I was listening to what Farida said and about questioning the concept of we and talking about, you know, we being here and we and them. I guess you are them being there. But we always have to stick to some concepts, because I don't see a concept that then you could not question. So this we, I like as a concept, because I like this distinction between you and I. So in that sense, we becomes meaningful for me. If we look at we, as you said, this is we and this is them, then it becomes questionable. So I would try to respond to your question in this direction. Every concept that we bring, that we build, and that we agree upon, be it on the national level as cultural policies, be it at the European levels or international levels, it can be in some way or by some group or based on some understanding, it can be questioned. But if we build on these concepts and try to make one step forward with every new development and every new effort, we are making a progress. Of course, I guess being a minister, I have to be optimist. I have to believe that there is a power in it, but I guess I wouldn't be a minister if I didn't believe that there is a power in these structures. So I had an honor a few years ago to be part of the panel that Farida Shahid, as at that time UN Rapporteur for Cultural Rights, organized. And then when we met now, and I asked you, like, what are you doing and what happened? And then you mentioned that somewhere, I can't remember now where, in one country, they actually took one of the conclusions of this report and they built, is it in Germany? And they built in it. So there are these principles. We can't say just because we haven't achieved all ideals that everything has to be dismantled and that we have to keep trying from the scratch all the time. But with every step forward, we are making those agreed principles stronger, and that really works, in my opinion, for the field of culture. Because one of your first question was related to this whole idea of if culture work is peace work. In my understanding, it can be peace work. It can be something completely opposite when it is misused. But if it is built around the principles that we have agreed upon and that we will continue to bring in the future, it will be a huge contribution to the peace. So this is where I see both the engagement of each and every individual artist and culture worker and culture policies, national and international, from through different forums, to have a big impact.
Maybe you can specify a little bit how forms of cooperation can be strengthened. I mean, is it only possible through political structures, you think, or do we need some kind of transculturation? Like, how do we strengthen cooperation in this field?
Well, I would say that, and this is where we come to this world of clicking, today the political structures are less important for actual exchanges. They are happening on many other levels and through many other channels, in my view, in a more effective and efficient way, and probably even in a more democratic way, that they would go through the concepts of traditional of understanding of the government's channels and policies. But still, I think that there is also a role for the governments who, if they are attentive to what the needs are, they can create structures that can strengthen these exchanges that happen directly and particularly through different networks which consist of different actors today. Because before, we had very strict divisions between government forums and non-government forums and business forums, and we know today that the way we connect, even tonight, we connect actors who come from different backgrounds and different powers or interests, but they connect in some sort of a reflection. So I think the role of these governmental forums is, first of all, to keep working on these internationally recognized principles and try to find ways how to monitor them again in as democratic way as you can, but also to be supportive and to create good circumstances for these interactions to happen.
Because I think you touched upon the ways of how people are connected today in different ways, not in political structures, but I think that's why we're, maybe we're coming to the internet, and the question of what will determine our future is strongly related to the internet and technological innovation. I think that's what you were kind of touching upon. Mr. Morozov, who are the global stakeholders who are shaping how we will live in the future? This, yeah. Well, in an article, in an article in the NZZ said you wrote last year that the global village never became a reality, and I think that's maybe something you were saying that we're coming closer together. We're a global world. There's different connections and connectivities beyond political structures, and you said they might be more democratic. You said that instead of becoming a global village and maybe more democratic, you said a feudal state evolved that was divided amongst tech companies and various intelligence services. So would you say that the promise of social emancipation through cyber culture that maybe many believed in the beginning was never real? Or was it ever real?
Well, I think it was real, but again, it's something that had to be nurtured and sustained. It's a rather expensive proposition to have an autonomous culture, whether online or offline, and left to its own devices and married to an ideology of libertarianism, which was heavily influenced by people who developed many of those services in California. I think the assumption was that somehow the market will take care of itself and will produce the kind of outcomes conducive to global collaboration and exchange and people engaging in some kind of global network public sphere on terms that would somehow be beneficial to dialogue. And I don't think that this is what happened, in part because the dominant mode to pay for the provision of those global platforms ended up being advertising, right? And advertising had a very particular mode of operation. And it's a mode that doesn't really care about what you talk about and with whom and at what depth, as long as you produce some activities against which advertising could be sold. And it just happens that it's activities that that are rather trivial in nature, whether those are watching, relatively funny videos or engaging in a provocative discussion with people we already know, that happen to maximize user engagement and user interaction, to use the language of these firms. So in that sense, I don't think that somehow it was a failed project from the beginning. There was clearly potential, and I think some of that potential can still be recovered. But the barriers standing in its way are not really cultural, are not only cultural. Those have to do with big policy decisions and trade decisions above all. Because ultimately, it's not just by accident that many countries fail to develop their own domestic platforms for social networking or search, and now have to rely on mostly American ones, and then there is China with its own autonomous industry. But even there, it's very interesting for me to observe China and also the reaction to it in the United States and Europe, because when you look at China now, ultimately it's the only other country, in addition to the United States, which has managed to build something on the scale of Silicon Valley. So it does not really rely on Facebook, it does not really rely on Google, and it has a very vibrant industry. But of course, in the kind of American and Western European and Eastern European mind, we think that China has this great firewall, which we think of as a censorship tool. But the Chinese, I would argue, think about it more as a trade tool, which has allowed them to actually build something autonomous and domestic, which of course is a point of view that is very hard to accept with a sort of mainstream liberal outlook that many of us share in Western Europe or North America. But ultimately, to go back to a question about stakeholders, I think that stakeholders that are represented the most at this point in the process of shaping this global infrastructure are in fact governments who pursue their own trade agendas, big multinational companies, which by and large happen to be mostly American ones, and that's pretty much it. You can argue for the representation of intelligence services who want particular standards to be introduced for data retention or for the way in which various communication protocols would be designed in order to make it easier to break into networks. Citizens as such mostly are missing from those discussions, and most of the fora that have been built over decades to make sure that their voices are heard are mostly fail to deliver by and large.
But is there any hope that we can regain technology and any of these tools for the common good? Or you said there might be a possibility?
Well, I mean, there is always hope. I mean, the question is how naive we would continue being about what it would take to get there. I mean, it's not, people who look upon the internet as something that was born in the 1990s don't have the historical background to understand that many of the questions that we are debating today about freedom, free flow of information, for example, or free flow of data, have a history that goes back to 30, 40, 50 years, with a lot of countries trying to use institutions of the UN and UNESCO and so forth to actually come up with a strategy to make sure that communication is not just about big multinational firms selling Hollywood films or, at this point, social networking services, but actually has something else attached to it. They have failed. It does not mean that you cannot do that, but that would require a very deliberate strategy that will ask questions about how value in the current digital economy is produced, what role does accumulation of data play in it, can we think of a different ownership regime for that data, is it data that belongs to the service providers or to the citizens, or does it belong also to other players, like municipalities, for example, that build much of the infrastructure on which data is extracted by sensors and smart roads and whatnot. Those are all big political questions that ultimately have a lot of cultural repercussions, but I think we need to be asking them.
But I guess, yeah, please. Technology and the technological innovation is something that is global and that at the moment lies in the hand of a few companies and maybe one nation, as you said, mainly America. How can we make it, globalize it or give it a global governance? Isn't that what we need in order to have a more access to it or more, maybe also influence on it? Is that even possible?
Well, at this point, it's going to be extremely hard because I just don't see the necessary global, even political infrastructure, forget about the technological one, that would be able to resolve many of those contradictions. At this point, I'm afraid to acknowledge that, but it's mostly national and maybe regional approaches that would work best. So at the level of BRICS, for example, there have been efforts to create alternative telecommunication systems, lay their own cables and so forth, because ultimately you need scale. At the level of the European Union, there are lots of innovation programs. There is Horizon 2020, there are many others, which spend billions on innovation. Very little comes out of it that benefits citizens directly, but they can be repurposed. I'm just not convinced that at this point the right answer is for us, again, to get together and to start a dialogue like we had with the World Forum on Information Society. There have been such fora traditionally over the last 15, 20 years. It's just that it's very hard for the developing, to use whatever term you want to use to describe those nations. It's very hard for them to make sure that their issues are put on the table within those fora. And we have seen it with the issue of global trade, where most of those mechanisms have now given way to regional trade treaties, and the big global architecture that have been built over the last 50 years does not really deliver either to the developed states or to the developing ones. So I don't really see the question of technology, data, and information flows being resolved so easily through those fora, even though it can be resolved to some extent through national and regional blocks.
Well, it's a huge topic that I think would need a special panel. But I would like to go back to the idea of the global village and how we are connected, through the internet, through transport, through communication today, through economics. At the same time, this leading paradigm seemed to be the globalization of the market and the liberalization of politics to promote individual freedom and economic growth. This kind of idea seems to, or this narrative of globalization and the promises of a globalized market, they seem to have lost their power in the Western world in the last few years. Are we lacking a good story, Chandra Nayar, for the people to believe in? This story of continuous economic growth and liberalization and all this. Is the story not working anymore? And if so, why not?
Well, the first thing I like to say is I was so taken by the conversation earlier. I was just going to say it was deep. Deep is usually code for I'm not sure I was smart enough to understand it all, but it was really interesting. But that ties into your question, and that too is a deep question, meaning I'm not sure I completely understood it. But I think I'd just like to go back to, I was in Berlin about, I think 3-4 months ago, speaking at a conference on the crisis of the global liberal narrative, which is kind of what you're saying. And my response to that was there isn't a global crisis, it's purely a Western crisis of the global narrative, because the global narrative was not my narrative. neither was it the narrative of the Chinese or everyone else. So the little soul searching going on in the Western world, and sometimes unfairly called populism because some people don't like it in the West. It's not the narrative in the rest of the world. So do we need a new story? Yes, we need a new story, but not a new story that provides comfort to those who created the old architecture, which is being dismantled. So I think the dismantling of that old architecture is what we are going through. It is creating discomfort within the realms of those who wrote the old rules. And I don't want to talk about us and them, and people jump to the conclusion that I am having a rant against Western this and that. But that's the world we live in. And the rise of the others will demand a new set of trade rules, new set of rules that govern the internet, etc. These will all be very difficult tensions. So I think the difficulty is going to be that as the others rise and demand a new set, who is going to give them space to have that conversation? And as I was suggesting a bit maybe flippantly this morning, for the majority of the world, there isn't a crisis of the global order because we never belonged to that global order. That global order was not ours. And so many wanted to space in that global order, and they're trying to find it. The challenge will be whether they will behave properly when they get a space to negotiate that new global order. So one thing will be, as China inevitably becomes number one, and I know that scares some people, but this will happen, I assure you, then how will it behave in terms of whether its power allows it to rewrite some of the rules? Clearly, then the issue will, how will the United States respond? As was said, those are the two sort of powers that are really going to shape at least the next, immediate future of the way the world operates. But I also think that it's important to not overstate the globalized world, because that too is an oversimplification of the world we live in. I always worry when people say we live in a globalized world. Why? Because you can click and watch pornography? Because you can click and watch cartoons? We're actually not that connected in terms of understanding what's going on. So I think that too is a sort of misrepresentation, in my view, of what is really happening in the world. Most certainly, in many parts of the world today, we're globalized. If you think that is good, the more people have mobile phones than toilets. I don't know if most of you know this, but as far as tech is concerned, the ubiquitous mobile phone now is more than toilets. Now, the point I'm trying to make subtly is that the ability for people to access those most basic rights in terms of sanitation, water, etc., is through technologies that have existed for a long time. These technologies have not become ubiquitous in the so-called globalized world because we haven't got the political will, the business models, etc., the new thinking that would make that world a better place for the majority. So I worry when people say we are globalized. It depends in which way you see the globalization of the last 50 years having taken place, and whether you see it as a net positive or a net negative. For many, it's a mixed bag. And the populism in the West today, as I said in the morning, is arising because as long as the net benefits disproportionately flow towards the West, then people were kind of happy, even those who were perhaps not at the top of the ladder. But as soon as that began to create fractures in the entire economic architecture, then it gave rise to populism. So that created the Donald Trumps, it created whatever you have in Europe, etc. In the rest of the world, it's seen as this is our turn. The question is, what will that turn look like, and how will it express itself? But what does globalization mean when, for instance, 5 billion Asians start to have access to global goods that's taken for granted in the developed world. It has huge other implications for the way the world will essentially suffer from the stress of that form of consumption. Is that the globalization that we are thinking of? So I'm not sure that this is the way to think about it, and I would argue that essentially, controversially, that the idea that we should all be globalized is not really a nice idea. The idea that the Asia-Pacific would be the globalized 20th century of the Asia-Pacific is a very bad idea too. And we will have to rethink what we mean by how globalization creates a different sort of prosperity, which is not about winner takes all and everyone can have everything. I hope that's not too deep, but I try to explain it in the only way I know. Thank you.
So, yeah, of course.
Can I just make a quick comment? Because I don't know how many of you actually go to villages. And I've already heard twice that it was not the global village and we didn't achieve the global village. But I'm afraid for those of us who do know villages, it's exactly like the global village. Villages are made of great inequalities, of great exploitations, of people not being included in decision making, at least the villages I know best. So I think we need to rethink how we're thinking of also not just globalization, but the global village. What does this really mean? And was this supposed to be positive? My experience is I don't want to be part of the underdog in the village at all, whether it is the village in my home or whether it's the global village. The second thing I just wanted to say is I also don't agree with you, Chandra, on this point that we're not part of the global order. That's like saying women are not part of the patriarchal system. We are, we just don't benefit. And I think there's a difference to saying that because that's what I heard. I may have heard you completely wrongly in which place, but I heard that the global order you were questioning because some of us, many of us, are not part of that global order. My view on that, it's like women who are part of patriarchy, who are part of development, we just don't benefit from it. So it's not that the system does not, you're not part of the system, you are very much a part of the system and why it is that it is what it is and that some people benefit and some people don't. So I think those are things that I just think we need to be a little careful about when we're talking.
Please, yeah.
Yeah. So if so if I could say, yeah, I mean, my point about we're not part of the global order was your point that we're not the beneficiaries. We're not determining it, we're not driving it, etc. And it's not our narrative. And that needs to change. The point I was then making is that the idea that somehow the Asia-Pacific or the Asian region will become the driver of that narrative is also a very dangerous delusion, because some people think, you know, now it's the Asian century, but this would be a terrible thing if the Asian century is premised around the framework of one region or one set of countries dominating others, which is what the British Empire was and the American century was. It was actually half a century, but the Americans are prone to exaggeration, so they kind of took the whole one. But and that's what I meant. The other point of the village, again, I meant it in the sense that the flippant use of the world that somehow we are all living comfortably in the village, the ideal village. And you're right to say, and I go to villages all the time because of my work, most villages are tyrannies, they are dumps, and you don't want to be in that village. That's the truth. So we need a different kind of ability for people to live together.
Imagination.
Yes.
And our cultural perspective.
Yeah. I would like to go back to the idea of that the globalized world that we all believe we live in, but maybe it's not true. And if we maybe, I mean, and maybe I go against what you just said, but like need more multilateral approaches, maybe more. I don't know. I mean, is that maybe what we should go into the future? You know, Bolien, if so, should we strengthen multilateralism from your point of view? And shouldn't we try to strive to a global order that is based on rules for everybody, and that everybody has to abide by, rather than rules by, I don't know, one or the most powerful, politically, economically, militarily? Shouldn't there be a, I don't know, a general rule that applies to everybody and everybody has to abide by? And then multilateralism, how could that work? Is it even something we should strive for?
Well, my initial reaction should be that we need more of that. But then when I hear your interpretation, for instance, of how you perceive why there is a rise of populism in the West, which I strongly disagree with you, that it would be because the Western countries, whatever that would be, I don't feel that they are privileged anymore, which is why they are playing on the cards of populism. I think it's much, much more complex. And it's my deep belief that the fundamental issue is a fear. And fear of different developments. And I guess this fear is felt in all parts of the world today. And in some societies, this fear is articulated through the reactions, which then in the political spectrum can create different forms of, some call it populism, I think, different kinds of extremism, which goes from extreme left to extreme right. We shouldn't limit the extremism only to the right we are experiencing. So when I hear you, and now if I can take just a few moments to go back to one of the events that I experienced when I was in Durban, in a program which was organized by Mike Van Kraan. That was in 2002. We had a training for culture workers from different African countries from the south part of the continent. And there was also one open public discussion. And we saw one documentary about multinational companies and how they were exploiting one country from the global south. And I was the only one from the panel, at this panel, that was coming from this bad West. And then someone stood up in this discussion and pointed to me and said, you know, you can't understand anything, you white colonialist. And I said, okay. So I come from a country that was in the communism, that never had any colony. It barely protected its own territory, and that went through the war 10 years ago. But you call me white colonialist. That is your, no, this is what I responded to this person. And I said, you are entitled to call me white colonialist, but this is so against any common sense. So in that sense, if we continue our discussion trying to make things so simple, like this is global West, this is global South, these are developed, these were in power, they are not in power anymore. I think especially today, when in this false idea of globalization, we have individually feeling that we have access to everything just because we have access to virtual reality. I fully agree that we don't have access to much of the things that we have illusion that we have access to. But in that sense, I think that exactly these principles that refer to individuals, to human beings, can create a new channels for, or new networks or new structures for building societies that would rely on those systems, on those principles. So in that sense, when you ask the question about global order, I wouldn't say a global order, because if you have an order, someone has to be able to implement, impose, monitor, and this doesn't work. It didn't work even with multilateral trade agreement, where there was a vested interest to control it, let alone with other things. But if you have a set of globally agreed principles, then, and this is where we in the field of culture, I would say, are very strong. We are not strong probably in having results, in implementing or walking very fast, making fast achievements. But I think we are strong in agreeing or finding some common values and principles that across the world, people who are engaged in the field of arts and culture can all rely on, and which are not divisive, but they are cohesive. And this is where my optimism,
I think
apologize.
there's already two comments. I don't know if you also want to comment, but also I have a question coming to this. Please comment first. Or
Yeah, I think it's thank you for saying this, and I am very optimistic, and I don't understand why that we have discussions where when you confront some blunt truths, one is seemed to be a pessimist. I'm an incorrigible optimist, incorrigible. But I also do know you need to look at the emperor with no clothes on, and you have to be frank. So when you say people are fearful, you're right. But if you go to India and China, most people are not fearful because they feel this is their time. And that's what I referred to. So where's that fear come from? I'm not an expert on Europe, so I'll go to the United States. So where's the fear come from? What did Donald Trump say? I will make you number one. Right? The fear comes from Americans believing they will not be number one. Number one in what? Playing golf? No. Number one, economics. Right? Economic growth premised on the ability to essentially seek the benefits of globalization disproportionately. The problem is, now 1.5 billion Chinese and Indians and others are coming. Well, there will be deep consequences, in my view, if they ape the American model. But as they arrive, they have essentially shaken the world. That has created the fear. That's what I meant. Those fears are legitimate. I totally agree. And anyone who says, you white people, etc., I would strongly object to that. This is not about that, but this is the world we live in now. And so I understand, as I said this morning, that it's very difficult, if you accept my premise of constrained resources, for those who've been used to a certain level of resource consumption to now accept a different level of consumption and a different level of distribution of global GDP. That is going to be difficult, and that's the point I'm trying to make. And I don't think, I realize that not all countries in Europe, the former Soviet Union countries, did not have a hand in making the rules. But the rules were made, historically, post-Second World War, by the Western powers. Not all, but some. So even in the UN, we can't change the rules now to have what will be the most populous country in the world in about 15 years, India, to sit at the Security Council. Instead, we have tiny, puny Britain, who just said, screw you all, we're leaving. We do not want to be part of this globalized world on the Security Council. That's what I meant. But I am very optimistic that Europe will essentially be that balancing power that will bring forward the ability to accept that others must sit at the main table and be part of writing the new rules. So I'm on your side, very much so.
I think there was a comment from Farida Shahid.
So, not exactly on that, but I do think I want to underline one thing, which is really important, as Nina said, that we should not fall into binaries. And I think one of the challenges before us that needs to be responded to culturally as well as economically in other ways is really this narratives of self which give you an either-or option. Either you are part of this community and therefore do X, Y, and Z, or you have done in the past, or not. And that is unhelpful, and I think it's unhelpful for multilateralism, or I don't know exactly what that term means, but let me say it's unhelpful for moving forward beyond the you and me against the us and them. Because as I said, I think we belong to multiple communities. Our multiplicity must be recognized. The narratives of the state need to change, so they reflect and I think this is one of the challenges that we face today, is that nation states are premised on this complete illusion that there is a nation that fits into a state. State boundaries do not coincide with people. And I think also I would wonder, when you say, People in India are not fearful. China, I don't know. India, I think lots of people are fearful. They're fearful of not being able to be parts, if nothing else, of the new changes that are taking place. There are people, so even within our countries, let's not try and homogenize. And I think that's the danger when we talk in simplicity. I don't think the world is simple. Unfortunately, it is the complexities which I think we need to take on board as we go forward and look at the dynamics and see how we can, as I said, people should not be forced to be a woman or an ex-religion or an ex-country person. If we want to move beyond these, us against them or whatever, the question we started from, we have to understand that we're many things at the same time. And that this multiplicity has to be reflected in all narratives of self and the other that are there. And to me, that's part of the democratic process at the end of the day. And yes, there's economics, and no, it's not easy. And no, I don't think we want an Asian superpower to take over. So maybe you're right, maybe Europe can play this intermediary role, but maybe Africa can. Maybe there are other continents and peoples which can play a role. So we have to look beyond, I think. We're just looking at the former colonial states and the new ones, and to see how to go forward. Maybe we need to rethink how we go forward.
Yeah.
Can I just
Yes,
make a
of course,
comment?
yes.
I just wanted to follow up on what Chandra said and maybe complicate a little bit this view of populism that he presented as driven by the anxieties that a lot of people in the US or Europe have about their status in the global pecking order. I'm not sure to what extent that actually fully reflects either the American or the European experience, whatever you look at, in part because, I mean, if you look at the US, it's not true that America's power has declined. The power of American citizens and workers has declined. American corporations are doing fantastically, not just in the tech sector, but in the financial sector. You can go through a list of sectors, sector by sector, and you'll see that they are still beyond competition. Their profit rates are doing fantastically. The fact that much of that wealth has not trickled down to people, and there have been deliberate policies to make sure that it doesn't happen, has in fact produced a discourse where I don't think that people actually are blaming the Chinese or the enterprises or the Indian enterprises. Mostly they're blaming the Mexicans who are coming and stealing their jobs in the United States. Right? And to some extent, I think you can find a lot of similar discourse happening in Europe, where we do have this nativist theme that is not driven so much by some kind of geoeconomic or geopolitical reality, but is driven very often by historical experiences of living and coexisting with people about whom we have quite a lot of biases and preconceptions, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe. But I'm also not sure that the framing of this issue as an issue of diversity and somehow I don't remember the word you used in the setting it up, either as multiculturalism or multilateralism, there is also a hidden danger there, because a lot of these populists of the right, they have learned quite a bit and they have regrouped and changed their thinking in the last 30 or 40 years. Many of them accept diversity, but in a very limited manner. They are more than happy to have a number of nations and cultures multiply, as long as those cultures do not mix and do not interpenetrate each other. So if you follow the discourse of the Nouvelle Droite in France, for example, consistently for 40 years, that has been the line of argument, that we are more than happy to see diverse cultures flourish. We are all for the multiplicity of cultures. We just want to preserve our own against the impact of global capitalism. Right? That's the discourse. And I think that it makes it very hard for people who are clearly not sharing this populist right-wing agenda to come up with an intercultural agenda, intercultural dialogue that fully liberates itself from these constraints. In that, dialogue, in as much as it does not result in some kind of intermingling, dialogue is something that also the right-wing movements will support, as long as it's just a matter of talking and not the matter of actually cohabiting within the same space. And this is where I think we need to a little bit rethink, but also articulate a forward-looking agenda also for what it is that we mean by dialogue. It's not just autonomous nations engaging in trade negotiations. It's clearly something else.
But what role can Europe play in this, for example? I mean, if we go back to that question. And also one thing that you said earlier, I would like to go back to, and maybe a question to all of you, because you said that we need globally agreed principles and maybe find common values. But again, whose values are we talking about? I think this is really, from what I understood from Chandra Nayar also, this is a problem to find common ground, because we have our values here in Europe, I guess, or in the West, and maybe there are different values somewhere else. So is there such a thing as universal values, or is this a total utopia? And can the European Union, for example, be somebody, to take a role in this, to find something, give a way, forward?
Well, I think in the past at least 70 years after the Second World War, whatever we would think of this system built around multilateralism, there are a number of issues on which we have achieved a certain level of understanding. Again, I'm boring with the concept of principles. We can talk about principles, about values. In some ways, we can also talk about rules. We have agreed in the field of culture, we have agreed more or less around the issue of cultural rights. Not that everybody respects it and everybody knows that is implemented, but we have more or less agreed on a number of issues. Or to have something which is more simple, we have agreed on the principles that we all want to protect our heritage. We have, at least in principle, agreed on the main idea of what we need to do around the protection of nature. Not that everybody respects it, but you would hardly find people who are responsible and who would speak against it. Not that there is not much spoken against it. So I guess in different fields, we are here talking in the field of culture. We are mostly coming from the field of culture. I think there are a number of these topics where there is a general agreement. Then the problem comes if we want to have a unified response or a unified way of dealing with these or implementing these ideas and the rules. This is where cultural differences, traditions, understandings, politics, power games come into place. And this is where you have systems where you implement them in a different way. In this sense, I, again, as someone who has been always had very strong positions in favor of the European project, with all its problems, with all its challenges, with all the crises that it is going through, and I'm only mentioning Europe because it was a question, I think it is a project that can serve as a good example. Was it easy, or is it easy today on different issues, be it political, cultural, sometimes very technical, economic, to come to an agreement? It's not, and it is only 28, soon to be 27 countries. There are compromises. Some are happy, some are less happy, but slowly you are trying to build some level of understanding, and much has been achieved. The crises come, some are stronger, some are less strong, but I think a European project is a good example, and we know what was in the first idea was the idea of peace in European continent, so we should never forget that. So there are no simple solutions. There is no one answer fits all. There is no, we can't, just because there are problems, and there are problems and misunderstanding and challenges in different issues, we just can't say, this is my understanding and my belief, okay, let's get rid of the multilateral order and let's try to build something from the scratch. Because why would we think that we can come up with something that would be? We need to work to try to fix things wherever it is possible. But this is probably just a government official talk.
Chandra Nayar wants to say something. I would like to just add one thing because it goes exactly in that the philosopher Slavoj Žižek also said that the European Union is a good idea because in today's globalized capitalist world, it offers the only model organization with the authority to limit national sovereignty and to guarantee standards with regards to ecology and social welfare. So that goes into what you said. But I think you, Chandra Nayar, have a different opinion. It didn't look like you were convinced.
I don't know if it's a different opinion. I just think I'd like to embellish that a bit. When we say, we can agree on many things, and you'll rarely find an international meeting where ministers come, where they just have to agree, but they don't have to sign up to any commitments. All of us can agree. We all can agree cultures need to be preserved. The world is a beautiful place we must preserve. But the reality is the political and economic imperatives do not allow for these things to be executed. So coming closer to the stuff I know a bit about, if you look at climate change, we have the Paris Accord, and the world is up in beautiful hysteria. The Paris Accord has no teeth whatsoever. It's a nice love fest, okay? And we'll see what happens, okay? So there's no teeth, there's no obligations whatsoever. You can sign up, but so what, okay? So we agree to the principles, but the biting actions that need to take place, we don't take place. I'll give you another example. Fisheries. There is no global agreement. We have no ability to essentially manage and regulate the way the seas are plundered. We can't do anything. So I think that requires another level of international obligations and commitments, which we don't seem to be able to do. And the evidence, if I could just say, climate change is essentially, and I don't want to go on the climate change thing too much because you'll all think I'm a greenie, but it's already been triggered. The question is, how extreme are the implications going to be in which parts of the world? But the data is very clear. On a much bigger scenario, we all agree. We want to save the environment, but we are living through the fastest rate of species and fauna extinction in 6 million years, not caused by external effects, but caused by human societies, the global economy. What are we able to do about that? We don't have any agreements. And I think the only thing that will take place, in my view, is nation states deciding it's in their interest to do something about it. And that's why, I'll just finish, China and India 10, 15 years ago were into the blame game on climate. Blame those nasty Westerners, etc., which is totally unproductive. So we never had agreement. Today, signed the accord, there's one country doing things, that's China. Right? Because the nation state in that sense is able to execute against something that's in its interests. The United States has decided that it is not in its interest at the moment to execute against the agreements because they believe they have a different future and their interests are aligned to something else.
But that means this is an argument against global institutions or global
it's
cooperation.
Not. It's not, but my argument is multilateralism is a nice, sexy word, and we all want to hug it. But when you look at climate change and etc., it's actions that don't have a multilateral agreement on climate change that has any teeth. And the only actions that will take place that are of any meaning is when the largest polluters, the largest nations, take action because it's in their interest and survival. China has stood up so far to do it. India's Prime Minister Modi said this is part of our civilizational goals. I don't believe India can do it because if I can be not controversial, it's too democratic to take action, just as the United States has proven. It is too democratic to take that biting sort of take the medicine, because democracies don't want that medicine, which is civilizational changing. How do you do that? So that's my point. But of course, multilateralism, we all want. So the way it works is great, but on the big issues, it's self-interest of nations that drive it. That's what I know from my experience on the environmental front anyway.
I think Ms. Shahid would like to get into this discussion.
From what I understood, well, not quite this discussion, maybe slightly before this one, but from what I understood, the US has not agreed, and then Mr. Trump has decided to withdraw from Paris, even if it's toothless, but a number of companies have said, we will go ahead and go according to this. So it's not always so simple, and what the state's position in the US is actually different from what the companies is. So I think that's another interesting thing so let's not just merely blame democracy. Because I think the democratic process cannot be limited to elections and voting, right? The democracy is meant to be about participation, and I think we need to get back to that. I just wanted to go back to what can Europe do. You know, this is not just a European problem, and I think we have to be clear that it's equally the responsibility of all of us everywhere. So it should not be seen as Europe has to do this for everyone in the world. That's a rather patronizing view of life anyway. But apart from that, I think all of us in our own countries have a responsibility, and I think the civil society needs to be strengthened, and what our tools of activism are will depend on your environment. So like Nina said, yes, there's standards. There's all these human rights standards, which you have the European Court, but guess where you don't have any inter-country court? Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific is 2/3 of the world's population. So we don't have those human rights institutions, but we need to work for them. It cannot be and must not be seen as something that Europe is imposing, that's something the US is bringing to us, because it will have no legitimacy. And so one of the challenges that we face is how do you indigenize, how do you make human rights discourse, understanding, institutions make sense to people. For us, human rights is not what has an emotive response. The emotive response is to justice. So there's a very strong difference between justice and human rights. And the justice is what calls people, and we need to somehow translate that into the work that we're doing. In terms of policies, I think one of the crucial things that I find problematic is that in terms of policies that take place, international policies, which are in other countries, there seems to be a virtual competition of donors to claim things as theirs. So it could be the Europeans, it could be the Germans, it could be the US, it could be the British, but they're competing to have their names acknowledged on whatever is happening, which is often very unhelpful if it is in terms of human rights, women's rights, things where you want pluralism and multi voices to be coming forward and to strive and to be heard. The last thing also is that we can't just talk about cultural policies in isolation. The cultural policies have to be seen together, and people have to make decisions together with things like trade policies, and they're not. So it's like, okay, culture here, let's go do something nice, but in trade, no, they're different rules. And somehow those two universes really need to come together if we're to make real progress in terms of no longer us and them, but many we's who can live peacefully together.
Thank you. Yeah, let's get over the us and them and include them. If you would like and have questions, there is one over there. Somebody with a microphone is coming.
Yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk. I just missed the level or the dimension of society and individuals and people and the dynamics of society and people, because we were like mostly speaking about Europe and countries and like on an institutional level. And if we're looking at people, their cultural exchange or cultural change is less to be controlled. I don't think that dialogue is something you can plan. It already happens if state wants it or not. And I also wanted to emphasize that migration is a really crucial point for many rich countries which have to face that people are coming if they want it or not. And looking at this from a historical point of view can be also interesting, because I don't think from a historical point of view many dominant cultures have any right to preserve their culture, because the culture, their culture, the present culture, European culture, is a result of a history which is based on excluding and exploiting people. So I am actually really interested in people coming here and hybridizing or changing these dominant cultures, and the fear of people who fear that they are losing their cultures. They just fear that they're losing privileges to people who are now coming and like making things more complex. So now, of course, you can respond to that, but it was more a statement than a question, I guess.
It wasn't a specific question to but I found interesting what you said about the dialogue between people, because I would think that the internet is one of the biggest or greatest tools for people to actually get into, I mean, we said it doesn't connect people so much, but I think it does. I mean, it opens up the world to many people, no? We have...
I mean, in a certain sense, internet is like airports. There are a lot of people passing through airports. How many friendships do you establish with people with whom you're boarding? I mean, it does not just require some kind of structural presence at the same time in the same place. It requires a certain, predisposition, interest, some kind of curiosity, perhaps some serendipitous encounter. Again, what I was saying at the beginning in my intervention was simply to point out that there are, at this point, structural constraints which push us either inward or towards subjects that we're already interested in. It has nothing to do with inherent dynamic of online communications. It has to do with the ways in which we have decided to pay for our communication. We have decided to pay for it with online advertising and so forth. So I do not see it inevitable that these processes will go on, but it will require us abandoning the way in which we have designed and built those platforms. And it will require massive funding going to a very different kind of encounter. It's like, serendipity, for example, right? Finding things that you were not looking for. Right now, it's an expensive proposition. Somebody has to fund the infrastructure for serendipity, because the default mode is for you to encounter things you have already encountered, because this is how you can sell you more things that are related to the interest. We've all seen those ads that haunt us forever once you have looked up a pair of sneakers online, right? So that's how things are now. They don't have to be that way, but we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that mere exposure to a different set of view or mere exposure to a different audience will somehow produce different structural outcomes for the rest of us.
Would you like to answer to
Can I
that?
just continue? Because I think the point that was made about histories and narratives, to me, it's very crucial. And so we need the encounters, human encounters, not via the net, people to actually engage and interact with each other. And yet the narratives that we see in the everyday, through the movies, through the television, through walking in the streets, are usually of a particular perspective. And it does not help. So while you can invest in the infrastructure there, I think it is the state's responsibility to provide opportunities where people engage with each other and do things together. I mean, in Bosnia, the places where people had overcome those strict divisions, because everything there is according to your ethnicity. You can't meet, you have 10 minutes difference, the building may be same, but everyone is separated. The people who had overcome that, when I asked them, they said, because we sit next to each other in class. So it's that interaction together, whereas in Austria, because they have separated streams, the Turkish migrant community, they told me, we never see each other from the ages of 5, if we're in the same neighborhood, to the ages of 18. By that time, it's too late. we've made up our opinion about each other. And so what I've always argued is that if you can't merge the classrooms, like in Bosnia is not possible at the moment legally or whatever, you can, the cultural spaces, you can do it in the sports arenas, you can do it. So encouraging people to just interact with each other, I think is vital.
You would like to...
few sentences, because when you mentioned connecting people, and I'm coming back to this question about European Union, in my opinion, if there was not any other result of this effort but the Erasmus program, I think a lot would have been achieved already, because generations of young people have been raised in a spirit that they want to go elsewhere, meet other people, learn about them, and start appreciating them. So I fully agree that this, and this is why I always point to, especially when we are in this kind of a circle, on this of the role of individual, and then a group of individuals which are, through different civil society initiatives, trying to make perceptions look different. I think the Erasmus, I would say the Erasmus project, the Erasmus effort in Europe is an excellent example of that.
Do you want to answer? So because there's another question.
I just wanted to say that I think to understand, I think getting to know other people, there's a national level. The two examples you gave are within a single country. Yes, yeah, but I mean, I don't want to sound like someone who doesn't, but most people in the world don't meet other people from distant places. They don't. Most people live within a homogeneous society, or less homogeneous, but within their national boundaries. It's only freaks like us that go over the world and fly and talk. Most people don't. There's a very interesting data about what percentage of the world's population never traveled more than 30 kilometers from where they live. So when I lived in Africa, I used to be, and today I go to different parts, most people have never been away. The unfortunate thing is now they have the internet, which creates another interesting dilemma. But, you know, connection is important, but as you said, I think it's hugely overrated. So I don't do Facebook, I don't do Twitter, or is it called Twitter? Because, you know, I got a life. I don't need that.
That's very refreshing. I like that very much. There was a question from here in the front row, from the gentleman there.
Thank you. Yeah, reference was made to the question, you know, that are there no rules and principles so far as the whole issue at stake is concerned? Well, of course there are rules and the entire framework which is very much there. The Charter of United Nations itself is a product of the system of international law, which has also metamorphosed into from a provincial cocoon into a law of nations, for instance, you know. Now, when you look at the Charter itself, it provides a blueprint, you know, the fundamental freedoms and human rights for all, you know. Now, there is a series of those instruments which came up, which basically talk about the cultural rights and protection of the people, etc. But we know very well that these things have come under strain. Consistently, they have come under strain on various grounds: ethnicity, religion, race, you know, plenty of those issues. And this is one of the biggest issue of concern at the global level, you know. The very fact that you ended up having almost 12 international criminal tribunals to prosecute and punish the people who were responsible for largely the crimes of ethnic genocide and those kinds of violence, you know. So the things have come under. So we need to actually seriously ponder over this issue as to what is precisely wrong with the world, you know. Why are we so intolerant? Why are we so in a sense, you know, not able to you know, accept the existence of the others, you know, who are different from you or who have a diversity, you know. Now, two concrete examples I'll cite, and maybe the panel can comment upon it. One is the assertion of a nation state to reach out to person of a particular origin, you know, my own nationality, for instance, you know, and how far you can go into the past. Like India recently reached out, you know, to provide consular assistance to an Indian national who is there in you know, who is on the death row on Pakistani custody, and India went to International Court of Justice, filing a case against Pakistan, for instance, The same thing was done by Ukraine against the Russian Federation, under Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, So you are talking about the people who have done something, and you drag them to International Court of Justice and ask for adjudication that is this fair, is this right or not. And also the related issue is that can a nation state step forward and seek to provide assistance, to somebody who moved out of the country sometime in the past? How far? 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years old? Like India has advanced this, what is called persons of Indian origin card, for instance, overseas Indian citizens card, for instance, So can you step forward and provide that in the name of culture, in the name of nationality, in the name of ethnicity?
Anybody would like to comment on that from the panel? It's total agreement here. But please use your microphone because I think people cannot hear you.
I don't think it's being done because of nationality, ethnicity. This is economics. I think the driving force, although I'm not in India, you would know better than I do, is really to be able to continue to link up all of the people of Indian origin because of the economics of it. I don't think it has to do, the use is the cultural connection. But I really doubt very much. In any case, I think today we're in a situation where nation states themselves are under question. Nation states actually have rarely existed as nation states, except maybe Europe. Everywhere else, the creation of these states that we have today is on the basis of genocide. If we're talking the US and Canada, it's on the basis of violence. You have state nations in our Australia, but so, the idea of what is this nation state is something that we have to start thinking about and maybe rethink what this is that the states are. And that doesn't have anything to do with the multinational corporations who are an entity unto themselves. So global governance, maybe we need to rethink.
There's one more question. Really, if it's a short question to the panel and not a statement because we're running out of time, we have one here and there's one in the back. I think that's all we can have time. A very short question.
Okay. Hello, thank you for the talk. My question is a bit of the nature of the perception and especially as now the economic balance is switching elsewhere in the world than it was in the last century. The economic system that was put in place by the West is something, and the way it's been put in place is another thing. Like when a country like the US is going into another country and say, we're going to make trade agreement with this country, and then the free market is going to take place. And these are two separate actions. My question is, at the places where the economic balance is going now, for example, China, what is the perception of the people or the government about these two issues? Are they do they want to reproduce the same economic system but with other with other agreements, or do they realize that actually a lot of voices also in the West are raising and saying, hey, the way we've been doing it made a problem?
Thank you. Would you like to comment? There is the microphone.
I think your question was, you used China as an example. Is there an internal discussion in China that the economic model that the Chinese have adopted, which essentially is a Western economic model, has reached a stage where that, at the other hand, it questions the implications of China further using it? Is that right?
My question is whether they want. It's also related to the question of the we and the others. We've been using these economic models as a separation. We've been saying we are gonna make this model function as much as we can benefit from it. So my question is are other like dominant culture in the world thinking else of a different way, or is it like just going to be the repeating story of what the US did, but on the other side of the world?
Okay, my quick answer to that, and it's very crude, but it's how I see the world. When you know, the world opened up and the other countries had the opportunity, post-independence, to join the global order and the economic models, they basically followed the Western economic model, crudely put. Why? Because we had no other ideas. So if you come from darkness, you just follow the one light, whoever gave you the torch. So the Chinese, as you know, I think it's 25 years ago, signed up to the WTO, and all of those things were essentially essential because the Chinese had no other option to join the world order and the economic model. And so they made a lot of concessions. Now they're stronger. They're essentially negotiating. In my view, and China is at the point where now it's questioning the price it's paid through that economic model, which is to essentially based on driving relentless consumption as the method of growth, and export-led consumption, which it has paid a huge price. Okay, so that's why the iPad is made in China and not in California. I think China now understands it has to do something else, and those of you who follow Chinese economics would understand now China is focusing on the domestic consumption, but it's still a consumption-led economy. In the last few weeks and months, President Xi has particularly talked about redefining China's economy through an eco-civilization. This is groundbreaking if what he means is what it's outlined. It will change everything. The signs they are very serious, and that's why I think this week or last week China has said it essentially will ban diesel, fossil fuel driven vehicles by I think 2040 or 2030. No country is yet. I think the French and British have tried to say something.
French.
All fossil fuels. Can the Chinese do it? Absolutely. Why? If they can mess with your reproductive system, they can mess with your car very easily. So the Chinese, I think, would do it. But what the Chinese are also doing is building the world's most sophisticated public transport system, which includes bullet trains crisscrossing China. And then they will mandate that you can't use your car in certain areas, etc. So I think that is the big challenge. I think the intellectual political struggle within China is between the sort of straitjacketed neoclassical economists trained at Harvard, etc., who've come back with those kind of flat earth society rules, and then the sort of ideologues within the Chinese government who see a Chinese civilization that will collapse if it continues along this trajectory. I think this is a struggle where no one knows what the answer will be, but it is a marker has been put down by the Chinese leadership around this eco-civilization, and bold steps are being taken. We'll see. I think they're aware the problem now is coming home, whilst in 30 years ago they adopted the only thing they knew.
Okay, we really have only 2 minutes left, so if you really have a short question. Is it not short? Do you have? Okay, yeah, I have a short question. Here we have one here and one there, but please promise me to be short.
I guess the question probably is short. I'm not sure about the answer, obviously. No, but it goes a bit into the direction you mentioned, Farida Shahid, and it was actually what I had in mind listening to all of you throughout, I don't know, the last 1.5 hours, really about the nation state. And I feel like from all the different angles that you've looked at, this whole idea of creating a we, and I don't know whether we want that, but that the nation state really is an obstacle to it rather than a solution. I didn't really hear a lot of ideas of how the nation state can benefit or can bring any benefit to this process. And still in Europe, I feel it's very, because you mentioned as well that Europe is probably the only context where the nation state has existed historically for like a long period, that here we are really afraid of looking beyond that, like being creative and rethinking this whole structure. And whenever you mention this, you're put in this very naive corner and people stop even talking to you. And so I would be really curious to hear, especially from the two of you, whether you have an idea or whether you see this debate shaping in other parts of the world, and whether it's just our European fear or whether it's just beyond question. But I feel really it's so crucial to look beyond it, but I don't really know where to start this debate.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the thing is, of course, the Europeans also took several centuries of killing each other before they got to their nations. So we have to remember that it's a longer history. But there was some agreement on what it is. But I think the basic challenge for everyone, and this is not just Europe, is that the concept of a nation state needs to change. There is not a singular nation in that state, which means that the history textbooks, teaching, the narratives, the monuments, the museums, everything has to rethink that this is a multi-people state now. And so it's not an imagined community of a singular identity. And that is something which I think is possible to do. It's difficult, it's a challenge. Also, I think, as Nina said, I mean, Europe is the only place which has tried to go beyond the nation state, right? It may not have succeeded, but certainly I don't see China doing it. Sitting next to China, I'm very scared about what's going to happen. I'm also scared about Saudi Arabia and their influence. But what I'm saying is that these are, the way in which we think of identity has to change within the nation state. And I think there are ways to take it forward.
I mean, if I could add to that, and I think the identity issue, I agree with you, maybe there are multiple identities within the state. But my premise is that my view is the 21st century is going to be defined by resource constraints. If we are to live in that resource constrained world, then at least in the large countries of the developing world, I think that the nation state, in terms of the institutions, will be indispensable. So in terms of beginning that dialogue, and without wanting to advertise, my next book is called The Indispensable State. And that without the state, the rules required to essentially organize societies in the most crowded parts of the world where resources are constrained cannot be done by NGOs and multilateral agreements. It's only the institutions of the state. So I argue that because of that, we will need strong nation states in the large crowded parts of the world. Nation states.
I just wanted to add a few comments that you see at the end we came to something where we all agree. I would fully agree there because our perception of the fact that there was something wrong with the nation state came primarily from the fact that we were associated nation state with one nation to which the state belonged. And this is exactly contrary to the principles. Again, I'm mentioning the principles, but coming to the cultural diversity and the idea that not multiculturalism, I would say cultural diversity, where you can respect different cultures that live within a state. But I fully agree that you need to have an organized system. And I'm not saying that because I have to sell a book, but I would be out of job without a state. So everybody has also their interest.
I think this is a very nice last word. Everybody seems to be agreeing at least on this. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for, but I promised you there will be, possibility to talk more. Thank you so much for your input, for your time. Thank you all for being here, for your questions. And before I say goodbye, I would like to invite you to, in the name of IFA, of course, to the lounge in the courtyard, where we can continue our discussion in a bit of a more informal way. So have a good night, enjoy, and thank you very much.